Hey everyone, it's Jennifer. If you've ever watched my videos before, you know that I like to take old products and kind of breathe new life into them. Well, today I'm going to take an old technique and breathe new life into it. So I'm going to take the good old-fashioned resist technique on glossy paper and add some extra color to it. So here's the card we're making here. It ends up with like a kind of a matte finish that's just kind of unique, something that you couldn't get on regular cardstock. And so I'm going to show you some tips and tricks along the way. I'll also talk about how to do traditional resist, their original technique, in case you've never done that before. This card also uses some new products from the recent Simon Says stamp release. And the stamps that I'm using is called Friendly Flowers. Lots of great images here. I picked my favorites that I want to use on the card and I've put them on an acrylic block so that they're ready to go. So I just have them like in a holding place here. Now the paper that I'm using is very unique. You don't want to use regular cardstock for this. This is actually Ranger's specialty stamping paper. This is a matte coated paper that has a really unique finish that's kind of slick, but it is matte. If you don't have this cardstock, you could use glossy paper for this instead. But for the resist technique, you need some sort of coating on your paper. Glossy paper works, or this Ranger specialty stamping paper is fantastic. I just love this paper. Now, I went ahead and kind of planned out how I want my stamping to be, just stamped out on a piece of scrap paper here. So this is kind of like my cheat sheet or my guideline that I'll follow as I do my stamping. I always like to start with this. This really helps me to save time and avoid any kind of mess ups along the way. So here you're seeing two tricks that I do to save time. One is to pre-stamp what I want to do to just quickly plan it out, and the other is to take out all the images I want and put them on an acrylic block so I can easily grab them and go. I'm going to go ahead and put a stamp pad underneath my paper here just because this is a large solid image. I want to make sure I stamp it completely. You don't need that, but I find it really helps, and I'll link to the one that I use in the description below and on my blog. Now I'm stamping this with Hero Art's Fresh Peach ink. I find that this technique works best with dye inks because you really want this to dry on the paper. Now, when I stamped on this, since it's a coated paper, you could either heat set it to dry it completely, or if you're impatient like me, I'm just dabbing off some of the ink with a fresh cloth. Now, the reason I do this is it ends up with more of a smooth image when it dries. And I just think it helps with that kind of matte look that we're going to end up with. So I just stamp it with a dye ink and then dab it off. You can use any dye ink for this technique. I really like the Hero Art shadow inks and the Simon Says stamp inks. They work great for this technique. So as I'm doing this, you'll see that you end up with a very nice matte finish to your stamping. I'm picking three colors here. That was first Fresh Peach from Hero Arts, Soft Cantaloupe from Hero Arts, and this is Sunshine from Simon Says Stamp. You see the ink kind of sits on top of that paper because it really can't absorb since it's a coated paper, so I just dab it off. I'll also link to the cloths that I've been using for my stamping to clean up my stamping and for what I'm doing here. They're very inexpensive. I got them on Amazon, but you could find any kind of cloth for this. Okay, so I'm just going to heat set this to make sure this is completely dry. You can see that it's dry by tilting it in the light and you won't see the glossy finish anymore. Okay, now what I'm going to do is stamp over this with Versamark ink. Now the reason I'm doing this is I want to capture that color underneath the Versamark ink so that later when we do the resist technique, that color kind of stays true. So I am going to stamp with Versamark ink right on top of the images, but slightly offset, just a little bit. This will give us a halo around our flowers. Now with the original resist technique, you wouldn't do the colored stamping first. All you would do is stamp on this coated paper with Versamark ink. You won't even see your images at all. Heat set it and then rub ink over it. But what I'm doing, my twist on this, is to do the colored stamping underneath the Versamark ink. So it's kind of trapped under there, and then do the resist technique over it, which you'll see in a moment. So I've stamped with the colorful dye ink, and now I'm stamping the same image on top, slightly offset with Versamark ink. And you'll see why I'm doing it offset in a little bit. Okay, so now this ink really just does not want to dry on its own on this coated paper since it's a pigment ink, which doesn't absorb into the paper, and we're doing it on a paper that doesn't want to soak up any ink. So what you want to do is heat set that. So you'll see that shine there. It takes a few minutes to heat set it. Just keep your heat gun moving and your paper will be fine. Okay, now it's time to do the stems. I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Green Apple ink, and I'll go ahead and stamp the stem. And then I'm going to kind of heat set that very quickly, kind of dab off some of the ink, and then I'm going to stamp on top of it, slightly offset with Versamark. The reason I'm doing both of these steps at once instead of doing all the stamps in green and then all the stamps in Versamark is because I am going to move my stamp on here. So this stamp set comes with this long stem, but you can kind of arch it so that the stem kind of angles different ways when you stamp it. So you saw I kind of moved it there. So I want to be sure to stamp it in the colored ink and then the Versamark ink before I alter how I have that stem arched. So I love long stems like this because you kind of turn them any direction you want to fit your project. I think this is a great trick with any kind of long stamp image, like a greeting. You can arch a greeting to go along a curved line or along a circle. It's a great way to get more out of your clear stamps. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and continue with the stems. You can see I've arched this stamp a little bit more than the others. Each time I'm stamping the stamp first in the green dye ink, and then I'm stamping on top of it with the Versamark ink. So now I decided to add 3 leaves. So you'll see that ink kind of sits on top of that paper. I'll dab it off. And I'm going to go ahead and do the other leaves and stamp on top of the leaves with Versamark ink. I'm going to go ahead and move along here. I've stamped both the layers, and now I'm going to heat set this very good. You want to make sure that this is heat set well before we go on to the next step. Okay, so now I'm going to take that white paper, which you could leave as is. I think it's nice as is, but we're going to do this blue background on it. And you might panic a little bit here, but don't worry, I promise it works. So again, as I mentioned, you want to make sure this is heat set well. Now I'm going to go through and add a blue background on top of this. So I'm using another dye ink. This is Simon's Stamp Audrey Blue. This is a great blue color. And watch what I do. Don't panic. I panicked at first, I'll admit. But I'm going to go ahead and put dye ink on top of this. And watch, I am going to smear this on. You want to press it down and smear it on. You don't want to be girly here. You want to make sure you get tons of ink on your project. And it's going to look absolutely terrible. But that's okay. If it looks terrible, that means you're doing the right thing. I'm taking that cloth and I'm just going to rub it in, and look at that soft blue background you get around your images. I just think that is so pretty. Now this is a pretty medium shade of dye ink that I'm putting on top. You can go and do this repeatedly. So I'm actually going to do this a few times. So this is the resist technique. Basically, you stamp with Versamark ink, and then you heat set it, and then you rub a dye ink over it. My twist on the resist technique was putting the colored ink underneath the Versamark. Now if you look, you see kind of a halo around my stamped images. That's because I kind of offset the Versamark stamping over the colored stamping. Now I could have stopped with just that soft blue background, which I think would have looked better, but I wanted to show you how intense you can get with color. So I went ahead and added an Island Blue Simon's Stamp ink on top, which is a darker blue, so you could see how it would work. Now you'll see the flowers kind of muted a little bit. The color of the flowers muted because of that blue on top, but not much. That's the joy of the resist technique. If you would have done all of this on regular cardstock, you totally would have covered up your flower with that blue ink. That's the joy of this paper. And I wish you could see the results in real life because it's got this nice kind of matte, slick finish that's just beautiful and very different than regular cardstock. This is a really fun technique. I really think this card design would be fun with just the regular resist technique. All you would do is stamp all of those images with Versamark ink and let it dry or heat set it, then rub the blue ink over it, and you would just have a tone-on-tone look. You'd have these soft blue flowers with a darker blue background. I think it'd be really pretty that way too. Okay, so let's go ahead and put our card together. I have this new die set from Simon's Stamp. It has a bunch of frames, and this will cut a super fine frame around our stamping here. Now I want to kind of plan out where I do this. I'm going to go ahead and use some painter's tape. I'm just getting it ready here so that I can tape it down. I wanted to use some die cut inlaying. That's one of my favorite techniques. I'm going to show you how to do it in a moment. But you can make this much easier if you just glue the die cuts on top. I'm using this new die set from Simon's Stamp. It's called With Sympathy. It actually has both of the words in the set, but I'm just going to use the word sympathy alone. I went ahead and die cut the word so that I could kind of hold it here to plan out where I do my die cutting. So I'm just positioning it where I think I'll end up wanting it on my card, and I'm going to use my tape to tape the frame in place. I just find putting a little bit of painter's tape or washi tape to hold the die in place really ensures that I don't mess it up as I'm doing my die cutting. Okay, so I'm going to run this through my die cut machine. I love the Vagabond. I'm using the Big Shot here because it's easier with my camera, but you could use any die cut machine for this. So I'm just going to go ahead and run it through my machine, and I end up with a super fine frame cut out from around my stamping. I'm actually not going to use that fine frame, the blue fine frame for this, but now I have my centerpiece cut exactly how I want it to fit that fine frame. Okay, so I'm going to cut the words sympathy and with apart. So I just have the word sympathy. I use wire cutters for that. And I'm going to die cut right through my stamped panel here with the word sympathy. Now again, this is the die cut inlay technique. You could skip this and totally just glue the word sympathy on top if you wanted to. Now as I take my die out, I'm going to make sure all those little pieces stay in my die, and that will save me some time in a few moments, you'll see. Now for the word with, to go with the sympathy, I wanted to have a small stamped image just so I didn't cover up my flowers. So I found this stamp set from Simon Says Stamp, and it has the word with in one of the sentiments. So I'm just going to cut out that word. Don't worry, it doesn't hurt your stamps, and you can always put them on the acrylic mount as they were intended if you ever want to stamp that how it originally is. I'm going to stamp right on top of this with Versamark ink and add my white embossing powder onto it. So I'll end up with the word with, white heat emboss, which will match the white sympathy die cut that we're going to inlay in a moment. So I'm just going to go ahead and heat set that, and this is really the only dimension that will be on that card, is that little bit of heat embossing. Okay, so now let's go ahead and pull this card together. It's kind of a puzzle piece because we're doing die cut inlaying. Again, you could save a lot of time if you just glued it all on top. So now it's time to die cut the white frame that from this same die that will be outside of my blue panel that we just created. And then around that white tiny frame, I want to have more of the blue background. So I'm going to grab the remainder of the blue background that I had from the piece I created before and just cut the sides down until I get the width of a frame around it that I want. I'm just using my trimmer here. There's no science to it. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. Now I have a piece of white cardstock that I'm going to cover pretty heavily with adhesive so that I can glue all of my pieces on top of this and end up with a nice smooth flat surface. So this is the die cut inlay technique. So I'm going to start with the outside. It's always easiest to start with the outside first. So I'm going to glue my blue outline frame onto the background so that white paper is covered with glue so I can just pop these right in place. Next is that white frame, that thin white frame. I really love this tiny frame. It gives a nice defined edge and looks so much better than just kind of matting each piece on top of each other. Now that that's stuck down, I'm going to go ahead and put my blue panel inside of it. Now we have the word sympathy left. Now this is kind of tricky. This is where I am crazy to do this die cut inlay technique because that word sympathy has lots of tiny little bits that need to be stuck back in. If you wanted to save time, you could have just glued sympathy on top of it and not done the inlay technique. But what I did is I kept all those little blue pieces in that sympathy die, the die itself, so I could pop one out at a time and put it where it belongs. So I'll pop one little part out there, use my craft knife to get it out, then I use my quick sticks to pick it up, it's got a sticky end, and stick it right in place. You could use tweezers too. And then we end up with that die kind of smushed into my paper, and I end up with a perfectly smooth finished picture here. So after I put all those little pictures in, or little pieces in, I'm going to trim off the extra of that white background, and there we have our finished panel. Very easy to do. I decided I wanted to pop this onto a card. You could glue it flat if you wanted to, but I always love a little bit of foam tape on a card. So I use my foam tape and I'll just add it onto a top folding card. People always ask why I do top folding cards. I don't know, I just like how they look. So you could use a regular card if you wanted to. Now, this is one of those times where I should have walked away from the card, but I decided I wanted to add some white highlighting to the card. If I were to do this card again, I probably would have skipped the white highlighting, but really it's up to you. So I decided to use my white Signo pen. This is my favorite white pen, to kind of add a little bit of highlighting and just little lines to my flowers to kind of trace it and make it stand out more. Whenever my pen isn't working real good and is being kind of moody, I just scribble it onto my finger and that seems to get it going. And if you color slowly, it seems to work okay. So it's really up to you whether you stop with the colored resist technique as is, or if you want to add kind of this outline highlighting to it with the white pen. Now, if somebody were to ask me how I know where to put these lines, I don't know. I didn't get it right, I'm sure. I'm not great at drawing, but what you could do is Google a flower similar to whatever flower you're working on, and you can kind of see where the lines are on that flower in real life and mimic that. But I just kind of went with whatever I wanted to. So it's really up to you how you do it, and I think at the end of the day, it really just doesn't matter. You end up with a nice card no matter what. Okay, so I've finished adding all those little white pen highlights, and that's it. We did a colored resist technique, which is a fun spin on the original resist technique, and we did some die cut inlaying also. And remember, you could make this card much simpler by just using the regular resist technique and not putting color underneath it, and by not doing the die cut inlaying or the white highlighting on top. So if you have any questions on the products I used, I link them below in my YouTube description and over on my blog at jennifermcguireinc.com. Be sure to head over there also for more information and some giveaways. Thanks so much for stopping by, and we'll see you again soon.